Thank you very much, and welcome to our audience, and I hope we'll have a few more people coming in from the back. My name is David Roche, and I'm an ethnomusicologist from the Bay Area, California, and I was at one time the executive director for the Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago, which is probably one of the largest community music programs in the world, with a very nice budget and a very successful way of dealing with world musics and local regional musics. And I was also in Rajasthan for many years ago, which is why I'm here at this panel today, because of a project whose acronym is in front of you here, RAP, Rajasthan Rural Arts Project, for which I'm a consultant. So that's my little backstory, and I wanted to just reintroduce to my left, Simon Broaden, the chief editor of Songlines magazine, journalism with world music, inclusive of traditional and contemporary, and what I think of as at the crossroads of the global and the local. I use also the co-editor of the Rough Guides to World Music, and directed Sufi Soul, the mystic music of Islam, with William Dalrymple as the presenter in that. And we'll be talking a little bit about that as we go along. On my right, Huib Schippers, founding director of the Queensland Conservatorium Research Center at Griffith University, and a stalwart in the action research world, world music education, and the co-author of Sustainable Futures for Music Cultures, which will be a kind of a foundation text for us to bounce off of a little bit, as well as for the Songlines. And is currently now curator and director at Smithsonian Folkways in USA. So without further ado, I'll jump into a question that will get us hopefully kick-started here, that references the Sound Futures Project, which Huib will tell you a little bit about. He opens that study with a very provocative sentence that I want you to take to heart and think about for a second. That goes like this: more people have more access to more music now than ever before in the history of humankind. Well, this seems to be kind of paradox if we're talking about sustainability, and if there's more music being listened to than ever before by more people, what's wrong with this picture? Or is it all right? And that's what I think we're going to base our inquiry into, the resiliency or vitality of various music traditions, and maybe beg the question of what is strategic intervention. The RAP project that we'll reference here is part of that an intervention or kind of positive meddling into the world of music culture, and what are the characteristics of good and beneficial stewardship. So here to tell us about this ethnomusicological project framing and lead a discussion on this is Huib Schippers.
I'll be very brief about this. There's a reason why I start a book on the sustainability of music cultures with a very positive sentence, because it is true that we listen to more music than we've ever listened to before. So the problem is not that there's no access. In fact, more people can find anything. So if you go on the internet and you've never heard Wagogo music from Tanzania, you type it into YouTube and you hear fantastic Wagogo music. So that is not the problem that we have at the moment. What happened with this great access is how do you deal with it, and how do you deal with mainstream musics and less accessible musics? And also, how do you curate these experiences? And that's why it's great to have someone like Simon around the table, who's been at the very center through the Rough Guides and through Songlines of curating the experience for people and guiding them where to listen, and rather than sort of the Amazon algorithm, if you like this, you'll probably like this, to go into, if you like this, try and get your ears around this one.
It's certainly true that music is more accessible than it's ever been, and the upside of this is there's a healthy audience, as we know, through Songlines, which has been going nearly 20 years now, and is covering music all over the world, traditional, popular, fusion, many things. Here's one we did about Ravi Shankar just a year or so ago. And I'm in the fortunate position of being able to go to a lot of festivals and see music all around the world. And what that means is as Huib says, you can get it on the internet, it's accessible that way, travel is much easier than it used to be, so people can go and see music, and festivals can bring musicians and put them on stages, Indian musicians on stage in Europe and the US. But music only functions and only works if it's serving its community. You can have this stuff, but it's no good if it hasn't got a sustainable basis. There's no point in just putting a museum piece on stage. And I think what we've been doing the last 2 days, we were at a 2-day conference where we were listening to fantastic Rajasthani traditional music. And I have to say, you know, I don't know how many of you here know the stuff, but both, if you're Indian, most Indians are living in urban places, or most of the attention that is given to music is to either Bollywood or maybe classical music, and the other music gets marginalized. And visitors to India, it's, you know, visitors to Rajasthan, there is fantastic architecture, palaces, we know those things, but music gets overlooked. So it's about finding ways in which this beautiful music can be more supported.
Thanks, Simon. And is it a case, though, that all music should be preserved? I mean, is it a no-win situation if one music culture falls down?
Well, music is a natural part of life, and music has got to have a function to survive. I think there's no point in preserving something just for the sake of preserving it. Most songs are about love and human emotions, and those don't change. The societies that support these things do change a little bit, and I think we can also learn to appreciate and understand the music. I think one of the crucial things is that traditional music, rural music, has quite low respect from the elite. And when you see the skill and incredible beauty of this music, I mean, Rajasthan has amazing string instruments, wind instruments, percussion instruments, amazing musicians playing this stuff. Yet these musicians are low in status, they're badly paid, and, you know, life is hard for them, and so the danger is they go off and become labourers rather than do what they do so well. Other sorts of music, like classical music or much more commercial music, inevitably gets more support, and that's why I think some sustainable development projects are worth doing. But of course, if a music doesn't have any function anymore, then yeah, why keep it alive?
Well, how do we get to the prestige of musicians, and how can we measure the sustainability, resiliency factors, and so on? And I think Huib, maybe this is a time to outline a little bit of the project and the parameters of a study of a musical culture.
With pleasure. Although my background is in Indian classical music, I'm a second-rate sitar player who's been playing for 42 years and has no excuse for being a second-rate sitar player. I also travel to a lot of other musical cultures, and one of the things that I found is that in every culture, musicians complain about how impossible it is to sustain their music. So there's no audience, there's no money, they don't play it on the radio, there are no concert halls, there's nobody who wants to learn it. And talking to people in Africa, in Latin America, across Europe and America, and in Asia, I thought these sound like symptoms to me and not causes. So what we did, we found $5 million in an old mattress somewhere, and I can tell you where it is if you like. And we got 9 teams of researchers on their way to look at very different kinds of music. So we looked at Hindustani classical music, but we also looked at indigenous Australian music, we looked at Mexican mariachi, but we also looked at Western opera. And for each of those, we tried to investigate what forces work on each of those music practices. And what we came up with is a model which is really quite powerful, saying that there's about 5 different domains of forces that impact on any music. It's how the musicians and the communities work, as Simon was mentioning, how music is learned. All music has to be learned in some way, and how it's taught. Or some music is learned but not taught. Then how infrastructure and regulations work on it, so whether it is taxes or the venues that you need, or even the materials you need to build instruments. Then how the media and the music industry interact with the music, which sometimes is very active and sometimes not very active. And what we've seen over the last 12 years is that the strong influence of the music industry has diminished enormously, because while we used to, I'm running a record label now, so I know, we used to make about 70 cents per track that we sold, and now with streaming, we're making about 0.04 cents per track. So the new reality of the new economic reality has kind of reversed from concerts feeding the sales of recordings to recordings feeding tickets for concerts. So there's some major changes happening there which affect all musicians across the world. And the final domain is what we call context and constructs. Context is very easy, which is basically in what kind of context is the music performed, while constructs is the whole system of values underlying the music, which is what is the cosmology, what is the relation to gender, to race, to social class. And one of the things we found to be the most important one across all those 9 case studies is how much prestige does a music have? And this can be fed in many different ways, from its historical awareness. In Hindustani music, I would say that Hindustani music has profited a lot in the last 100 years from the national project of building India and getting national pride. And Indian music basically changed its history for that. So we forgot the 19th century in the Baijis, but we said it came from the temples and the mosques, and then it went to the courts, and then it's here with middle-class Indians. So people construct their histories to increase their prestige, and all of that's fine, because that's actually become a very, very healthy music in the minds of all experts. So that's in very, very short how we use an ecological model to look at music, which includes change as well. While many preservation methods are very much about, we'll take this music and we'll put it somewhere in a museum and it will stay beautiful forever. But it's like picking a flower and putting it in a vase, and after 6 months, it's not very likely to look very beautiful anymore. So as Simon was mentioning as well, the rooting it in community and keeping the community feed the music constantly is really a core idea of this book, which is out with Oxford, Sustainable Futures for Music Cultures.
Thank you, Huib. There's issues of patronage and change in terms of the infrastructure here, and do you have any commentary on what you see as factors in the current situation in Rajasthan with folk music after a couple of days of
that's some thorough field work there. But we did have a very intense 2-day conference that Simon and David mentioned as well. A shift in patronage is something that's happened all the time. So look at Hindustani classical music, I know more about. So the patronage was in the temples and the mosques, and then the patronage was in the courts, and the patronage was in the kotas, and then the patronage was with Indian middle class, and now part of the patronage is also with a global audience. We shouldn't underestimate how easily music recontextualizes, how musics that are clever, like Hindustani classical music, and I think Rajasthani music will have this as well, how easily they shift with new opportunities. I was talking about this with Zakir Hussain a few years ago, and said Indian music has always been very clever to find where the money is. And that's not a bad thing to do, because so did Johann Sebastian Bach. So if he saw a possibility for a gig with the church, he said, oh, I'm such a deeply religious person, please let me compose music for your beautiful church. If he saw a prince that was rich and was looking for a musician, said, there's nothing I would like to do more than making dance music for you. So the reality is that musicians have always served whatever the possibilities are, and that has enriched music and diversified music and kept music alive. So there's nothing to look down on. So I think the challenge for Rajasthani music is to see, with the shift of patrons that has taken place, and effectively goes back to independence in many ways, that we need to find who our new patrons are, and then if the new patrons happen to be tourists, which is pretty realistic with Rajasthani folk music, make sure that there are mechanisms that we really think what we do with the essence of the music and keep it linked to the community. So if tourists say, we just want you to play Happy Birthday on Rajasthani instruments, that would be a bit of a sad loss of an incredible amount of repertoire. But the tourists don't really want that. So there's enough tourists that want to hear the authentic music in authentic environments. So it's a matter of constantly and intelligently repositioning a music in relation to its changing environment. We're not going to stop changing environments. We just need to be smart with how we react to changing environments.
Thank you, Simon. You want
Yeah,
to
I was just going to say there are various things that are already happening. But yesterday I had an unbelievably depressing experience. I'm staying here in a rather grand modern hotel called the Lalit on the edge of the city. And in the center of the hotel there's a huge sort of glass box with a sort of fake Mughal pool in it. And on 7:30 each evening, folk musicians and a dancer come and perform in that, on a terrace in the middle of that pool. It's totally inaudible because there's glass all the way around it to the people in the hotel, and it's just like it is like something in a glass cage. Very sad experience, and it's things like that that don't help the music. Now, there's an amazing festival called Jaipur, Rajasthan International Folk Festival, which is essentially a showcase for Rajasthani music. It happens in Jaipur every October. And okay, so one festival, however big and spectacular, one festival a year isn't going to save music. But what feeds into this festival is a whole lot of festivals all over Rajasthan. So there's local things feeding into bigger local things, feeding into Jaipur. Now this is still not enough to keep music going across a whole state. We visited on the first day here a place in the center of Jaipur, which is going to be a center for Rajasthani music, a performance space where people will play every day, and the music will be sort of curated and will be really good. And I think when you see great music being played, you know that there's a truth and an authenticity and a genuineness behind it. And I think this is something that is really achievable. And what I would hope, you know, with a festival like this is we should see more traditional Rajasthani music on stages here, or maybe take people from here to this new performance space, you know, each day of the festival, so that having it endorsed by something like JLF gives the music, you know, a boost. I also was interested to know from David, as a person who's spent time in Rajasthan, you know, I'd imagine that with independence 70 years ago, that was when patronage would start dying off. Why is it only now that people are getting sensitive to this issue?
Right, and it's a complex issue on many levels about the level of patronage, but I think that part of that is the loss of the continuation of a privy purse to the 500 plus princely states at independence was maintained until 69, and then 71 it became the 26th Amendment to dissolve. And I was in India at the time, and it was a front page story every day about the privy purses. But that
so in still 69, regional, you know, former Maharajas and things still had money to pay local musicians. Right,
so that's at the top of the social hierarchy, but all the way down, the kind of mutual activities happening with what's called the Jajman system, or Jajmani, in which there's reciprocity between you provide music for your patron in exchange for cash in kind, and that filters through all different kinds of craft and necessity distribution. So that maintained itself in, my take on it is that it maintained itself in Rajasthan for a longer time than other parts of the country, and there were more princely states and intermarried. So the idea of music that provided by professional cast musicians held on here for quite a long time, a longer time. Then again, you had, at that time, at 71, you began to have the Langa and Manganeer community, who were consummate professional musicians playing world festivals, that began to start, that kind of touring. But I think that if it's a crisis of patronage, that there's another aspect that hasn't been really explored in that way, and that is the loss of someone like Komal Kotari, Komal Das, he was known, who I was privileged to travel with in Western Rajasthan for a couple of seasons, and then the loss of a patron like John Das Singh, who this is patronage not only financially directly but indirectly, because Komal Da was a folklorist sort of in the vein of John Lomax, if you're familiar with the Lomax family and Alan Lomax doing the recording. John Lomax was someone who recorded cowboy songs that were still surviving after the Civil War in the United States, and by the early 20th century they were disappearing, and his recordings and publishing revived that. So that a year ago from now, I was running what's called the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada, and cowboys nowadays are herding by helicopter, but they're still singing these songs. So Komal Da was somebody who put together an archive of material and documentation in a systematic way, worked with other scholars and international guests from around the world, and cobbled together a social economic system. And John Singh came along and was also very engaged. So I think the patronage nowadays is not just about, or going forward with the rap project in particular, is about enlightened patronage, and on every level, whether you're a scholar or a financier or a student. I mean, that there's a role for everyone to play in this great heritage.
I mean, I would say it's also important that the music isn't just preserved, but it does change. And, I want to hear cowboy songs about herding by helicopter.
Right. They're on their way. We were talking about narco ballads, so there are all kinds of things having to do with the current social situation, whether you can sing them or not in public. This is something I wanted to ask you and Huib about. What to preserve, what not to preserve, and is there a strategy there that, especially in light of the Sufi world and the Sufi festivals you've been involved with, and in terms of the many projects that you've been involved with? So, you want to
I'll say a little bit about Sufi music, because I'm a big fan of Sufi music from all over the world. I mean, obviously, Qawwali from India and Pakistan is probably one of the most popular forms of Sufi music. William Dalrymple and I spent quite a time making a film, and I've gone on spending a lot of time visiting Sufi shrines, getting musicians on stage in Britain. And I think one of the great things about, say, Qawwali is that it's quite easy to take it away from its context in a shrine and put it on stage, and it still works. It really stands up as music, and you can go, whether you're Muslim, whether you're religious or not, you can go and hear the music and think this is a great musical experience, much as you would go and hear Bach. The other thing in terms of existential threats, I don't think there's any fear that Sufi music isn't going to be performed anymore or is going to die out. The bigger problem is the sort of threat from hardline Islam, which disapproves. Some people disapprove of it. And we know in the last year, 18 months, there have been bomb attacks in Pakistan, for instance, and musicians and spectators killed because they're playing music. And this is, a political problem.
Huib, do you want to talk about being disappeared as a...
Yeah. I agree with David and Simon that music goes through very natural cycles, and not every music has to be preserved. While we get incredibly excited about an obscure form of Assamese music, nobody cares about the music of Pat Boone. So some of you who are over 60 here might still remember the music. My mother used to use it's crooning. So it was the old. There's no society for the preservation of the music of Pat Boone, because people that had its time and it passes on. When I was interviewing Pandit Ravi Shankarji on Drupad, he said, "Oh, everybody talks about Drupad and it's so great and it's the core of our music. When I listen to Drupad, to me it looks like a skeleton. Somebody's holding up a skeleton and says, 'This is a beautiful woman.'" So we have to be aware, but interestingly, Drupad has been revived through a French ethnomusicologist, Alain Danielou, who started inviting Drupad musicians to come to Paris. They came back with good reviews and with lots of money, and then suddenly the Drupad melas started coming about. So understanding these processes that generate new interest for things, that generate new income sources for things, that also interest new patrons. So yes, Rajasthani music has lost two major patrons in the last 10 years, but you still have the patronage of the Maharaj of Jodhpur, which is not the least source of patronage to have. So the constant searching for people of influence, people who have money, people that can move crowds. Some musics do really well by getting film stars involved. Using those things not as you're selling out our music, but by getting enough ears to listen in the direction of that particular music and say, hey, this is really interesting. Whether these are people that are going to just come to concerts or whether people that are starting to learn it. And as long as we will have people that will listen to Langas and Manganyars, there'll be people within the communities that want to learn. By the time that goes wrong, people will say, I'm going out of this profession, I've seen this in other cultures, I will not learn this music anymore. And then you get into what linguists call moribund music, music that is on its way to die. And if the community itself says, we don't care about this music anymore, let it disappear, then let it die gracefully. If the community says, we actually really care about this music, how can we be helped in understanding what the forces are that are working on us and that we can influence, then a model like the Sustainable Futures model, the musical ecosystems model, might be useful for those communities.
Thank you. Before we go to some questions and open up the floor for questions, I just wanted to tell you what the Rajasthan Rural Arts Project is a third phase of Jaipur Virasat Foundation work of culture that started with the Jaipur Heritage Festival, which morphed into this Jaipur Literature Festival. And then the Jodhpur Riff that Simon was referencing is also a part of the JVF. And now this is the third phase. It started last March with a Kala Samvad with 97 artists from 17 different musician or performing arts communities coming to Jaipur. And out of that session was developed a set of ideas for implementation. And then we've just met this last week a group across many different communities in Rajasthan who have access to the music as musicians or as scholars or as administrators to help them move this forward. And because we're embarking on a project that hopefully will bring all the right people together in the right room so that this incredible heritage that you have in Rajasthan continues in the right kind of way. So that's kind of the message of the Rajasthan I'd
say one thing before we go on to questions. One of the musicians we saw these last few days was a guy called Mama Khan. He's a Manganyar singer with a band of musicians. Now, he's in a way an example of someone who's been incredibly successful with his music. He's performed in films. If you go on YouTube, there's a Coke studio recording of him that's been watched over 8 million times. Now, this is a guy who isn't cheapening the music. He was performing for us and performing really some of the most pure, fantastic Rajasthani music, absolutely in the tradition. But he does what any wise musician does and directs his music to different audiences. So when he's performing at a pop festival, he'll add guitar and keyboard. When he's performing for, die-hard traditionalists like us, he'll do that repertoire. But the point is, this is music that's very attractive to a lot of people, and that's why it's worth preserving, I would say.
And to follow up on that as a patronage, his latest Desert Songs album was crowdfunded. So there's a patronage model that's meeting up with the digital age, and that's where these new ideas for patronage will be good. Oh, and we have some booklets if people are interested later when you leave. But I'd like to open the floor to questions. The lady, and we'll do one at a time, and a volunteer will come around with a microphone, and anyone that you choose.
Front row, come on.
Front row, here we go.
It's not just about front row, but it's also not just a question either, because here is a link of that period between 79 and now. We created a festival called the Desert Festival in Jaisalmer, giving the Langas and Manganiyars their land where they were growing up. The sense of their music belonged to that place and where it flourished. What nature denied, the landscape gave in abundance. And sir, I have written a book, it's a coffee table book, where silence sings. It's music and dance of the desert. So there's a huge gap because of the new patronage, the Jijmani as it was called, shifted to tourism front. If Lalit and all those cannot handle, that's the corporate error because the sensitivity. And also now I shifted from the folk genre only for this region, that every single hotel, even the heritage hotels, with due respect to the Rajput owners, are presenting kish and not even giving the sense of what is what. Unless I explain that this is a song of Langas, why did they sing, which part, and the lyrics are a huge contribution. So I personally feel, as an anchor, as a compere, as a visualizer of the festivals, that your idea is fine. But unless it is packaged correctly, I now do for the Rambagh Palace, and I have shifted all to what is called the palace music, because that is the ambience that nurtured the Kathak or that nurtured the instrumental music. So my point is this: musicians are fine, packaging those who are producing the show, and also it has to be brought to the people. Unless that is done, it would still have one event in the city. And it's not a question, I needed to share it because there is a huge gap between Komal Kothare-ji, with due respect, he was my mentor as well. John Da, all these people were working with a few artists who are going abroad, but giving them the whole thing. And I had to do it, I had to share it.
Thank you very much. Are you willing to work together?
I'd say the other really important thing is that the musicians themselves are behind how they're presented. You know, it's no good just having some curator say do this, do that, but it's also got to grow out of the musicians' desire of what they want to play and what they want to do. Let's go to the second, yep, and then the lady in front afterwards.
Yeah, how much of this, you framed this largely in terms of the question of preservation and people finding patrons, but how much of it might be, say, if you compare it to the film industry where people like Mira and I are tapping into the angst and needs of the modern society and finding their creative space in the articulation of those needs and emotions. And to me, that's often seemed to be the basis of a lot of driving for music. So is there work going on to help musicians think about how they can tap those emotions and articulate those in the traditional communities? I know with the Lomax project and things like that, that's happening in the West, but it's been a shift of that drive to communicate. And I'm curious how you see that.
We're definitely not talking about preservation only as a static preservation, and traditional musicians have learned over the ages that you adapt to whatever the new circumstances are, and then there are individual musicians, and I think Mamen Khan is a good example, who reach out further than some other musicians would. So there's the integrity of every musician who feels what they need to do. There's also the need to feed themselves and their families, and I think every musician and every family of musicians will take their own take on this. There doesn't have to be a single answer. What we find across the world is that the strongest the strongest musical cultures are the ones where there's a great diversity of approaches, where some people will engage with this and other people will stay there. So a range from what my father taught is the only right thing and that's how it should be done, to, hey, we're living in a new world, I'm going to bring my music to shopping malls in a particular, or online in a particular innovative way. This is how you keep traditions alive. So what we're very concerned about is that this ecosystem remains diverse and that particularly people stay aware of how to negotiate it in the most intelligent way. And all of us struggle with negotiating the world as it is at the moment. It's very, very complicated. So negotiating the ecosystem for a traditional musician is quite a challenge. And I think we don't need to tell them what to do, but for us to be part of the facilitators of dialogue so that people make choices that empower them to carry on their tradition on their terms is, I think, one of the crucial things of our times.
A quick response to that. I mean, obviously the number of musicians who can go and work in films is relatively small. The more we can create an awareness about this music and the potential of this music, the more sensitive directors and music directors will think of using this sort of music in their films. The other thing that people are already actively doing is teaching a lot of these musicians digital skills so they can market themselves through the web. And we were given concrete examples of you know, a musician getting booked for really big weddings through creating a beautiful website with good samples of what he could do. It's simple things that, you know, we can all learn, frankly, just selling our skills. Lady.
My question is specifically about repertoire, because as you said, patrons change, audiences change. But if music, like in the Rajasthan traditional music scenario, has developed out of a particular ecosystem, as you call it, where life cycle events, rites of passage have been the sorts of things, have been the subjects of the songs, what happens when those relationships no longer matter as much as they used to? Do you find musicians now singing about a different set of things, composing new things? How does composition evolve in this changing context?
I think we have to realize that composition has always evolved. So what we as we tend to think that authentic is what the oldest person we've seen has done. But that person might have been very controversial when they were young and saying, you're not doing the thing that my grandparents were doing. In Indian music, I found examples in the 19th century where they say, oh, the great ustads, they're doing this music, but look at their sons, it's complete crap what they're doing. And 100 years later, we got Ali Akbar Khan Saab and Ravi Shankar and Kesava Kerkar. So I think we have to realize that these changes have always taken place. And what I see across the world is that sometimes some of these songs are being retained because of the very reason that they represent something that was of historical importance. And other ones change, and we can't stop all these processes. We can talk to people and say, hey, that's really interesting that you still sing a song that has to do with the visit of Akbar to Jaipur. But if people want to forget that, then they choose to forget that. It's not up to us, middle-aged ethnomusicologists, to tell people, to tell communities what they should preserve. It is up to us to start a dialogue and to create, to try and provide the instruments for people to make their music flourish in the way that they think is the right way.
In Georgia, there's beautiful traditions of polyphonic, many people singing together, which is done these days, I mean, either on stage or around the table when you're eating. But there's one type of song which is really beautiful, which are actually ploughing songs. And now nobody in Georgia is ploughing with horses and things anymore, but these songs have moved from the fields to the table, and they're in a completely different context, but they're still sung, and they're very beautiful. So people obviously still feel that they're beautiful. They're not serving any real function as ploughing songs, but they're still performed.
We have Pradeep, do you have a question? Oh,
okay,
oh,
yes,
okay, yes, yeah, the gentleman right there.
I think the new opportunities of patronage have opened up, not only tourism, but film, government, internet, and so on, as you mentioned. But what about the quality of the music? These new avenues, do they reduce the quality? For instance, Komal Kothari, who was the first to promote and preserve the music of langas and manganiyas, used to tell us that these langas and manganiya singers used to sing about around 80 raga and raganis, semi-classical music, which have now been reduced because they have to cater to the popular interest of the tourists and so on, films and so on, reduced to about 20 ragas, raganis, so that the repertoire is reduced and the quality of music goes down. And secondly, what about fusion music? Do you think that it represents an authentic music art form, or do you think, like Ravi Shankar later on realized that it was a mistake to go and do this fusion music? Do you think it represents an authentic kind of music? Thank you.
I think you shouldn't underestimate that almost all music is fusion music. I grew up with Western orchestral music. If you take every instrument that was influenced by the world of Islam from an orchestra, there's a triangle on stage, because almost all the techniques and the instruments have a root in the world of Islam. So I think it's a bit confusing to speak about fusion music as a bad influence. The concern with quality is something you have to keep alive within the communities. And we will see shifts of going up and down. So many people, including myself, in Hindustani music think that the young generation is focusing too much on technique and too little on the depth of rag. There'll be a next generation where that will come back again. We have to see that these things go in fluctuations, and the only thing we can do is to be intelligent stewards of these processes, because we can't change how people do things. We can only help people do things the way that they think it's the best way to do it.
And I think that is the end of our time. We're going to have to continue the questioning. It will be on the side of the stage or outside. We can continue on. Thank you so much for attending, and please do support Rajasthan local music.
There are leaflets about the Rajasthan Royal Arts Programme down here too at the front of the stage, so pick one up and have a look.
And there's one copy of my book which I'll sell by auction.
We wish to thank Huib Schippers, Simon Broughton and David Roche for this wonderful talk.